Battle of Agrigentum 261 BC, Rome's first major victory. I remember the smell of dust and olive smoke before the fighting even began. We had been outside Agrigentum for months, digging, watching, and waiting, while the walls stood above us like a challenge we could not yet answer. Then word spread through our lines that a Carthaginian relief army was coming, and the city's defenders were preparing to break our siege from inside. For a moment it felt as if the whole war in Sicily had narrowed to one plain, one city gate, and one day. We had come to starve Agrigentum into surrender. Instead, we were about to meet Carthage in the open. I was one of the Roman soldiers drawn into Sicily during the first great struggle with Carthage, when neither side yet knew how long this war would last. Rome had crossed into a place that was not ours, and every town on that island seemed to have a choice to make. Some saw us as liberators from Punic power. Others saw only another army marching under foreign standards. Agrigentum was one of the most important Carthaginian strongholds there, a wealthy city perched inland in southwest Sicily. Not far from the coast, but strong enough to anchor an entire region. The consuls that year, Lucius Postumius Megellus and Quintus Mamilius Vitulus, led our forces. I will not pretend I always knew which man gave which order, because in a siege the army often moves as a single machine. What mattered to us was that Rome had decided not to storm Agrigentum recklessly. We would hold it in place, cut its supplies, and force it to break. That was the plan when we first surrounded the city. Agrigentum stood on rising ground, with walls, gates, and enough food stores to survive if the countryside remained open. So we closed the roads. We guarded the fields. We watched for wagons, boats, and messengers. Ziga work in Sicily was never just about ladders and rams. It was about grain, water, and patience. Every day we tightened the ring, and every night we listened for movement beyond it. Inside the walls, Hannibal Gisco commanded the Carthaginian garrison. He was not trapped alone. Carthage understood that Agrigentum could not be lost cheaply, because if it fell, our grip on western and central Sicily would grow stronger at once. So, they sent help. A relief force began to gather, and soon we heard that it was marching to break the siege from the outside while the city held us from within. That changed everything. A siege is one thing. A siege with an enemy army approaching is another. We were no longer waiting on walls alone. We were waiting on a field battle. The months dragged on. Our lines hardened into habit. We built earthworks and kept watch from dawn to dusk. The men of the garrison learned our routines, and we learned theirs. From time to time, we saw dust rising beyond the city, or movement on the roads, or signals from the walls. Hannibal Gisco was clearly waiting for the moment when our lines would be stretched thin and our supplies tired. We were doing the same to him. Each side believed the other would weaken first. What made Agrigentum dangerous was its position. The city could not be starved quickly unless the countryside stayed sealed, and the countryside around it was useful for any army trying to maneuver. Open ground meant cavalry could move, infantry could form, and relief forces could try to strike at the Roman camp. So the siege line itself became a battlefield in miniature. The Romans had to guard against sorties from the city while also facing the possibility of attack from outside. That pressure slowly forced us into a more exposed posture than a siege commander would prefer. Then the relief army arrived. I remember the first sign was not a trumpet but a cloud on the horizon. Men on the forward lines started pointing, and the officers rode along the trenches, calling us into order. The Carthaginian force set up beyond our works, while the men inside Agrigentum watched from the walls. Now the two Punic forces could try to combine their effort. They did not need to defeat us in one grand charge. They only needed to keep us off balance long enough for supplies and morale to crack. We formed as best we could. Heavy infantry in the center, cavalry where the ground allowed it, and the rest of us ready to respond to whatever break appeared first. The exact numbers on either side are not certain, and ancient accounts do not agree, but there were enough men to fill the plain with shields, standards, and dust. We could see that the enemy outside the city was not a mere raiding party. It was serious enough to force a decision. The turning point came when the battle stopped being about the walls and became about the space between us and Agrigentum. The relief force pressed us outside the siege line, and the defenders inside the city began looking for a chance to strike in support. That was the danger. Two Carthaginian forces trying to meet while we were stretched between them. The fighting opened in confusion, but not in the way poets like to imagine. It was more practical than that. Men advanced, hesitated, reformed, and pushed again. Lines shifted on the slope, and in the open ground outside the walls. What mattered was not courage alone, but timing. If the defenders had broken out at the same moment the relief army pushed through, our position could have been split. Instead, the Romans held long enough to blunt the outside attack and keep the city's men from turning the fight into a complete encirclement. I saw the center settle into a hard shove of shields and spears. Our men advanced in ranks, then checked, then advanced again as the officers shouted for them to keep their order. On the wings, cavalry and light troops fought for the ground that would decide whether we could envelop the enemy or be thrown back. The terrain helped us only if we used it well. On open ground, control of the flank meant control of the battle. We needed the enemy to lose cohesion. When they did, everything changed at once. The Carthaginian line outside the city began to bend. First it was a gap, then a wavering in the files, then a retreat that spread faster than any command could stop it. Once that happened, the defenders inside Agrigentum could no longer rely on a clean junction with the relief force. They had to choose between staying behind the walls or risking disaster outside them. By then, the choice was gone. Our men pressed forward, and the Punic position broke. What I remember most is the sound when order failed. A line of soldiers can hold a field in near silence, all breathing and grunting and waiting for commands. When it breaks, the noise changes. Men call out names. Officers shout too late. Shields strike shields at strange angles. Horses stamp in panic. Somewhere behind all that, the city still stood, but the battle had already turned against its defenders. Once the relief army gave ground, Agrigentum could not be saved. Hannibal Gisco and the men inside had lost the one chance that mattered. The city's walls were still there, but they no longer protected a strategy. They protected a trapped garrison. The Romans had done what siege warfare in Sicily demanded. Hold the enemy in place long enough, then meet the relief force in the field and break it. After the battle, the capture of Agrigentum followed not as a separate miracle, but as the consequence of the fight we had just won. The Carthaginian defenders were defeated, the relief effort failed, and the city fell into Roman hands. For us, that meant more than a single victory. It meant the first major Roman success on land in Sicily during the war, and it proved that Carthage could be challenged there in open country, not only at sea. The aftermath inside our camp was mixed. Men who had been starving, digging, and standing watch for months suddenly found themselves in possession of a city that had once seemed too strong to touch. The fields around Agrigentum, the roads leading away from it, and the positions it had anchored all came under Roman control. That changed the map of the war in a very real way. With Agrigentum taken, Rome strengthened its hold over western and central Sicily, and the Carthaginians lost a base they had trusted to hold the center of their power there. I also understood, even then, that this victory was larger than the men who won it. Polybius, who wrote of these events later, treated battles like this as evidence of how Rome learned at war, by fighting it. Agrigentum was not the end of the First Punic War. It was the beginning of Rome's confidence in Sicily. We had entered the island as newcomers. After Agrigentum, Carthage had to treat us as a power that could besiege, endure, and win. By the time we marched on, Agrigentum was no longer a Carthaginian stronghold, and Rome had its first great foothold in Sicily. That was the true meaning of the day. Agrigentum marked the moment Rome turned a siege into an early victory that changed the war in Sicily.